Greetings to everyone joining us today. My name is Young Richard Kim, and I am Associate Professor in the Department of Classics and Mediterranean Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Kalos ήρθατε σε όλους. Our program today is presented under the auspices of the Embassy of Greece in the United States, and it is a result of the fruitful partnership among the Hellenic American Leadership Council, the Classics and Mediterranean Studies Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago, the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan of Chicago, the Consulate General of Greece in Chicago, and the Foundation for Hellenic Studies, Illinois. I would like to extend my sincerest greetings and thanks to our partners, including Madam Ambassador Alexandra Papadopoulou, Connie Mortoupalas, and the Greek Embassy staff, His Eminence Metropolitan Nathanael of Chicago, Endi Zemenides, Executive Director of HALC, Consul General of Chicago Ekaterina Dimakis, and other members of the Consular Corps, Chancellor Michael Amaridis and my other colleagues at UIC, and the members of the board of the Foundation for Hellenic Studies, Illinois. Today's conversation is the second of our Philhellenism Through the Ages series, in celebration of the bicentennial of the Greek Revolution. Building on our last conversation about Philhellenism in the Roman Empire, we continue our exploration of the persistence and perseverance of Greek culture and its manifold expressions in the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. In addition, we will discuss what role the idea and memory of Byzantium played in the development of Greek identity on the eve of the revolution. I invite you, members of the online audience, to join in the conversation by posting questions in the comment section of the Facebook Live feed. It is my honor to introduce my guest and conversation partner, Dr. Anthony Kalvelis, who is professor in the Department of Classics at The Ohio State University and is one of the leading experts in the world on Byzantium. I encourage you to visit his departmental website for a list of his numerous publications. Dr. Kalvelis, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Young. Thank you for inviting me.
So this is a really exciting opportunity for me to spend some time talking to you about a subject that is near and dear to both of us. And I thought I would begin just by asking perhaps the most basic of questions. Who were the Byzantines and what was Byzantium?
So, Young, for the benefit of our audience, I should say that so you and I graduated from the same program, right? The Department of History at the University of Michigan, although I don't think we overlap that much. And we now both chair departments of classics, right? So we have those things in common. Have you ever been in an administrative meeting and someone mentioned the Byzantine administration of the university?
Oh, yes. That's a favorite adjective of many people out there now.
So that's happened to me twice in the past month, and I find myself typing in the chat. I'm like, hey, don't do that. Anyway, trying to educate my colleagues here about not using that word. Anyway, okay. Let's start with the basics. Byzantium is the modern term by which we call the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. So this is just the Eastern Roman Empire. It's the part of the Roman Empire that didn't fall, right? And it continued down to the 15th century. So, losing territories along the way, but basically intact as a political organization and coherent society. This later version of the Roman Empire, it was Christian Orthodox, and its religious identity evolved over time to become something much more recognizably Greek Orthodox, as we would call it today, though that term wasn't used that way then. At the same time, it continued its Roman political identity. So the majority of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire considered themselves Romans, not Greeks. We'll talk about that. This is a matter of identity, like what labels they used and what narratives they told about themselves. So the short answer is that Byzantium is the Eastern Roman Empire between the 4th and the 15th centuries, and its culture is predominantly Christian Orthodox, Greek-speaking, with a Roman political and later ethnic identity. Why we call it Byzantium is a different matter. Maybe we shouldn't get into that, but the term became an established a term of art for historians in the later 19th century. So it's quite recent, actually. Yeah, so that's the short answer.
So the people who lived in the Eastern Roman Empire at this time, they would never have gone around and said, "Oh, we are the Byzantines." Then was that what you were saying?
That's right. That's a term that was used only in rare cases for the population of Constantinople. This was the capital of the Eastern Empire, and Constantinople was built by Constantine the Great in the 4th century on the site of a pre-existing Greek city of Byzantium from antiquity. And so the name of that ancient city was sometimes used as a classicizing way of saying Constantinople. So if you were a Constantinopolitan, which is a bit of a mouthful, you'd sometimes just say Byzantios.
Mm.
But it didn't refer to the empire as a whole. There might be one or two references that way, but it's very uncommon. So no, they wouldn't be using that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful to understand that. So let's begin with this idea of let's just with a working assumption that the 4th century, because you mentioned the Emperor Constantine and the establishment of Constantinople. So let's begin with that sort of as our working time period, our framework. What can you say about Hellenism in this period? What was it? What did it entail? And perhaps you could also connect Hellenism with this other concept of paideia or paideia, this system of education that was prominent in the Roman Empire at the time.
Sure. So this is where things get a bit tricky. Hellenism is it's a very big concept. It encompasses lots of different things. At times, it's a very contentious, polemical concept. So for the benefit of the audience, let me just kind of split it into two parts. And this is a way that I have found is useful in explaining it, especially to Greeks or Greek Americans or someone who have knowledge of part of this legacy, but perhaps they know it in a kind of disjointed way. What we call the Byzantine Empire begins when the vast majority of the population of the empire are still polytheists, right? So they're worshiping the ancient gods. They have festivals for the ancient gods, right? Constantine comes along and declares for Christianity, but it takes a while for that to become the dominant religion, right? So there is a period in the early centuries when like actual paganism is a real force, right? And this is a time when even Egyptian hieroglyphics are still being written, right? People are worshiping Zeus, right? It's like a part of antiquity. At the end of Byzantium, so over 1,000 years later, all of that is gone, right? The culture is very, very different by that point. And in the kind of Hellenism that like a modern Greek would recognize is much more part of lived experience, right? So not worshiping Zeus or anything like that, but rather icons in churches, right? Venerating icons of the saints, this sort of speaking modern Greek, that sort of thing. So Byzantium is this bridge between the kind of prestige Hellenism of antiquity and the more kind of vernacular folk Hellenism of modern Greece. It's a transition between those two things, right? And our notions of Hellenism are, in a sense, both anchored in that Byzantine transition, in the sense that it was the Byzantines who preserved what we have of the classical tradition. The texts that we have, the monuments that they preserved, like the Parthenon, right? They turned it into a church of the Virgin, so it survives that way. They copied Plato, so we have Plato, right? So the Byzantines are responsible for kind of codifying and defining the shape of the classical tradition. At the same time, their own culture, like from their own time, not the legacy that they inherited from antiquity, but the way they lived, provides the foundation for like general modern Greek life, and not just modern Greek, but it was part of a cultural koine that you can find even in Turkey and other places as well. So Hellenism is this spectrum. So you asked me about the very beginning. So let's go back to the early centuries, right? So at this point, a couple of things are happening that are pretty interesting. First, this classical tradition is kind of being codified as a body of literature and scholarship that all educated people sort of need to know in order to, qualify as educated and, interact with their peers on that level. But at the same time, the church, especially after Constantine, is realizing that, okay, now this is a society that is now ours. Converts are entering the church in very large numbers. And their concern was to, basically eliminate ancient polytheism and the practices of ancient religion, which the emperors did through legislation and the church, participated and so on. Well, it just so happens, we probably shouldn't get into the reasons for this kind of complicated, that the Greek church, so the Greek-speaking Christian church, labeled paganism and polytheism as Hellenism, right? So, in other words, they designated that which they opposed religiously and philosophically as Hellenism, because Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, was the dominant form of ancient religion that the church was contending with. So this is paradoxical, right, if you think about it, because if non-Christians or non-Judeo-Christians are Hellenes, this means that Persians and Arabs and the Chinese are Hellenes. And we actually find this in texts of the time. And it's the most striking transformation in the use of a word, right? So we think of the Hellenes defeating the Persians in the Persian War like 1,000 years before this. Now, the Hellenes are the Persians, right? So this made both the term Hellene sort of toxic and very problematic, but it also meant that the church had a conflicted relationship with the classical tradition as well, because Homer is full of ancient gods. So those are the broad parameters of Hellenism in the early period. They kind of get set then. It is two things: a prestige classical culture that even Christians enjoyed and liked to consume, and educated Christians wanted to read it and to study it and to perform it. But at the same time, as Christians, they had this strange love-hate relationship with it, because it had all of this pagan stuff, all this immoral stuff, about the gods and their sexual immorality and things like this. So those are the parameters of the debate over Hellenism.
It's your description is so interesting, and it actually reminds me of a figure that has figured prominently in my own research, Epiphanios, who was famous bishop from the island of Cyprus, and wrote a very large what we call a heresiology, in which he described 80 different what he thought were heresies against Christianity, and included among those heresies in the first four is Hellenism. Now, the way he unpacks that, of course, is very different from how you just explained it, but nevertheless, in his own thinking, Hellenism was something to be condemned as a heresy. And yet you really kind of bring out the subtle dance that they're doing, trying to negotiate this relationship between Christianity and Hellenism. And based on that, I actually wonder if you could spend a little bit of time talking about a figure also from the 4th century who was quite proactive in sort of defining and setting the parameters of Hellenism. And that, of course, is the Emperor Julian, who ruled from 361 to 363. I wonder if you could just sort of share your thoughts about the Hellenism of Julian the Emperor.
Sure. Well, at first sight, Epiphanius and Julian seem to be sort of very opposing figures, right? A hardline churchman who's looking for heretics, and and Julian, who was the last pagan emperor. He was a nephew of Constantine, and he was raised as a Christian, but during the course of his studies, especially classical texts and classical philosophy, he sort of secretly converted himself somehow back into polytheist thought, right? And he kind of exemplified for forever after the danger of getting too close to the classical texts, right? Like not studying them just for education and entertainment, but taking them seriously. And so he secretly reverted to polytheism, and when he became emperor, sole emperor in 361, he basically came out and announced to the world that after a generation of Christian rule, that now the gods were back in power, and that he would restore the temples and the sacrifices. And he went around sacrificing everywhere, and so just kind of performing his Hellenism, which is what he called it, and which the Christians understood as polytheism, paganism, very provocatively. So in a certain sense, he was almost sort of trolling the church, like, yeah, I'm an emperor now, I can do this. And that wasn't so much the problem. The problem that Julian posed, that the Christian fathers never really found a way around, was that he argued that the classical tradition is inherently pagan, that the ancient writers were inspired by the gods, and that you're not really understanding Homer or Plato unless you take their religion seriously, and you can't teach them, right, or claim to be educated if you're not one with them on that, right? I mean, it was a provocative and extreme stance. But at the same time, there were sort of Christian hardliners. To a certain degree, I guess you could put Epiphanius in this category, though I think he's more ambiguous than that. But there were some Christians who were arguing basically, yes, Julian's basically right. Like, we need to give up all of that pagan stuff and, Homer and all of these goddesses and whatnot. So it's kind of this strange case where opposites kind of meet. But those hardliners didn't prevail in Byzantium. So Julian was killed in Persia after 18 months of rule. And the Christian establishment pretty soon afterwards sort of settled into a kind of middle ground. This is better exemplified by Gregory of Nazianzus. And Gregory of Nazianzus, a father of the church, also called the theologian, St. Gregory the theologian. He was actually one of the leading theologians of the early period. He found this kind of middle ground where you could keep the classical texts for their beauty and their rhetoric and their thought, like rather not their ideas so much as the techniques by which they articulated them, the logical reasoning that they used, these kinds of things, and use them for Christian purposes. And he did that himself, and so he became the kind of model that the rest of Byzantium looked to for that kind of, keeping the classics but keeping them at arm's length, the kind of love-hate. So they avoided both extremes. But they never forgot Julian. This is the thing. It was a challenge that the church never forgot, that those kinds of texts can lead you into apostasy, and that, there's something polytheistic about Homer. You can't get away from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in some ways, the middle perspective between these two extremes of full embrace versus complete rejection, that was actually the perspective that lasted through into the next centuries. And closely related to that, then I wonder if you could comment a little bit on this, because a lot of people think of Hellenism first and foremost in connection to the language, Hellenica. So what is the relationship between this sort of culture and language? And in particular, because this is the Eastern Roman Empire, what about Latin? Poor Latin. What happened to Latin in this sort of period moving forward?
Well, let me pick up on the Latin part, because I'd like to allude back to the previous conversation that you had about Philhellenism in the Roman Empire, which your audience should definitely go watch that too if they haven't already. In a certain structural sense, the Byzantine engagement with Hellenism is similar to that of the ancient Romans, right? Look, so among the ancient Romans, you have some people like Cato, right, who project this kind of anti-Hellenic Roman nativism, like that Hellenic stuff is just going to corrupt our own culture. And you have at the opposite extreme, you have Romans who go Greek, right? They go all in. And they're kind of mocked by their fellow Romans for being Greculi, right? Little Greeklings. just because they affect, they leave beards and they speak Greek and things like they go native in a sense. And those were in the ancient Roman tradition, those were the kind of two poles that the culture generally sort of steered between them. So it's very similar in Byzantium, basically, except instead of Roman nativism, the problem is like, Christian hardliners. So in the same way, Byzantine culture steered a similar middle path when it came to Hellenism as a temptation and a challenge on the one hand, but also as a threat on the other. Okay, so the language. This is a very important point. So when you were taught Greek, you were probably taught with the Erasmian pronunciation, right?
When I originally learned ancient Greek, yes, absolutely.
Right. So the Erasmian pronunciation was, to a certain degree, invented. This is in 16th century Europe, and it spread there, afterwards, precisely in order to not use modern Greek pronunciation. Okay. So it was the final divorce between European classical scholarship and relying on Byzantine or, late Byzantine or Greek scholars to teach Europe Greek. All right. Now, in actual fact, the Greek language had been evolving in the direction of modern Greek long before Byzantium, right? So a lot of the vowel shifts had already happened, and even the grammar and the syntax were, in spoken Greek, insofar as we can access it, we're already moving towards something more like modern Greek by the early to middle Byzantine period, right? Which means that a speaker of modern Greek could, with some adjustments and some experimentation, converse with a Byzantine fairly easily. All right. But that language, the spoken language in Byzantium, especially after the 8th or 9th centuries, this was very different from classical Greek, which is the language that remained the prestige language for writing. And most Byzantine texts that we have are written in the high register, sort of closer to ancient Greek. And so it becomes a culture that has sort of two languages. It's got this internal diglossia, right? Like, so high register Attic Greek is the highest, and the more vernacular spoken. And there are a bunch of registers in between. So you asked what happens to Latin. Latin as such fades out of Byzantine society, let's say after about 600 AD. So it continues to be spoken by a number of people in the Balkans. The Emperor Justinian, for example, in the 6th century is a Latin speaker. Also Greek, but I think Latin was his native language. And many at the court. But after the 6th century, the operations of the state switched to Greek. And most of the population is Greek-speaking after the 7th century. So Latin kind of fades out. However, the spoken version of Greek had thousands of Latin terms embedded in it from all these centuries of Roman rule, right? So certainly everything relating to like law and the military and administration and taxation, these were heavily Latinized vocabulary we find in there, but also a lot of words from daily life and basically the marketplace of things. So terms for sausages, lucanico, and bed, cravation, and oven and things like this. So spoken Greek was to a certain degree a Latinized language. And when a Byzantine sat down to write formal Greek, in part the process entailed avoiding all those Latin terms, right? So we have these two languages. We have the imitation of ancient Greek, which the Byzantines at times could write very well, right? But also something closer to spoken vernacular Greek that has a lot of Latin in it. Well, what did they call these languages? So this is the interesting thing. The elite Attic register was almost always called either Hellenic, Hellenic, or Attic. It could be koine sometimes. For ecclesiastical Greek, it wasn't quite so stratospherically highfalutin, right? But I have found that around, let's say, the year 1000, the spoken language is increasingly called Romaic, Romaica, or Romaica. And this is in part because it was spoken by the Romei, the Romans. In other words, they named the language after the ethnic label rather than the reverse. So from that point on, down to the 19th century, and this becomes even more explicit in the Ottoman centuries and even into the 19th century, there's two languages. There's Greek and Romaic. Right? So that's how the languages fit into this picture.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've kind of brought us down in time to, let's say, at the turn of the millennium, around 1000 AD. So by this point in the Byzantine Empire, what aspects of Greek culture or Hellenism or whatever label we use, what aspects of that culture were flourishing? Were people still putting on dramas, or like Euripides, or and I guess the reverse question is, were there some texts or some aspects of that Greek culture that either kind of fell by the wayside or perhaps were even actively sort of suppressed? I'm curious as to sort of what of the ancient Greek culture by 1000 moving forward is still being studied and carried on at this time?
That's a great question. I mean, it brings us to the heart of debates over the sort of continuity or rupture in cultural change between antiquity and the end of Byzantium or even the present. So some things disappeared. So, for example, the ancient Greek athletic games, right? Whether through it was a combination of economic difficulties. So the athletic games had endowments, and those endowments suffered pretty dramatically in the 3rd century because of inflation and all kinds of problems. But also declining interest. It just seems that they became less and less relevant, especially as Roman games became more and more popular, especially the hippodrome races, right? Like what you see in Ben-Hur or something like that. So the Greek cities in the East, first they filled up with, gladiatorial combat was pretty popular for a while, but not under the Christian Empire. But hippodrome races, those were super popular, and they just kind of replaced all existing native, Greek games. But think also of like the culture of nudity, like public nudity, right? And not just statuary, but like the whole culture of the gymnasium, right? Where young men go and work out in the nude, or ancient Greeks knew that was unique, let's say, right? That other cultures didn't do this. It's a very unique part of ancient Greek culture, but that could not possibly survive Christianization, right? So if you were to compare sort of later Byzantine or modern attitudes toward nudity with ancient Greece, you would find a wide gap. Like you can barely bridge that, right? And the same goes for the whole, the festival culture and religion. All of those things changed dramatically. But there were many, many things that survived. The language obviously is one of them. And let me just add that because I mentioned earlier how the language changed, and we got from ancient Greek to modern Greek. Nevertheless, I think it's very important to point out that the Greek language overall has changed much less in its 3,000 years of recorded history than possibly almost any other language. Yes, all languages change all the time, but the gap between those two versions of Greek is not enormous. Be that as it may. So the language was definitely a conveyor of continuity in all kinds of ways. And the classical tradition was also as a cultural artifact, right? That is, as a thing that a culture points to as being important to it. And for Byzantium, it definitely was. So copying all of these texts, by hand for centuries, that is a serious investment, right? So in Byzantium, to copy a book by hand, let's say even half the dialogues of Plato, which we're already looking at 500 pages in a modern edition, right? That it costs more than the average soldier makes in 4 years. The total salary and benefits, right? So it's expensive, it's laborious, and so if you just look at how many ancient texts we have and think, wait, we have these because Byzantine scribes and patrons and readers and bishops and high officials and emperors thought that this was worth keeping, you realize what an enormous investment in preserving this legacy they made, right? And yeah, so some things they preferred and some things they didn't. And so we've lost the things that they didn't want to keep. If you look at the corpus, you can see this is an interesting area for future research too. Like, why do we have the texts that we have? What did they say? How did they speak to a Byzantine audience that we have them? Because this is very important. The Byzantines did not copy these texts so that we have them. I mean, yes, maybe in some, Ktima SIE kind of sense, possession for eternity, right? Yeah, sure. But they copied them because they wanted them. Mm. So why did they want all of those orators and historians? But they didn't really want the lyric poets, right? They wanted all the stuff that came from the earlier Roman Empire, like all the Plutarchs and the Galens and all of this, but they didn't really want stuff from the Hellenistic period, right? We have like parts of one historian from the Hellenistic period, Polybius, and that's only because he's writing about Roman things, which the Byzantines were interested in, right? So yeah, a lot of stuff we've lost because it didn't correspond to Byzantine tastes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of framing how these things come down to our own day. It's what they were interested in investing at the time and reading at the time. That's really fascinating. I just want to remind our audience too, if you have any questions for Dr. Kaldelis, please throw them up in the chat, in the comment section, and at the end of our time, we'll have some moments dedicated to asking him some of these questions. I want to pitch something. You have this podcast series called Byzantium and Friends. And again, I really want to encourage our audience to go and you just Google Byzantium and Friends and you'll find the link. And you've had a series of really fascinating conversations with various scholars about really all manner of aspects of Byzantine history. But in particular, you had a really fascinating discussion with Dr. Bauke Vandenberg about Homer, and specifically about Eustathius of Thessaloniki, who was both a bishop and a scholar and someone who was deeply interested in, invested in Homer. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about, by this point, what is the relationship between Christianity and Homer, or Hellenism, embodied in Homer? And have things changed dramatically from the time of Julian and the time of Epiphanios and Gregory of Nazianzus?
Yeah, so you're talking about like the 11th and 12th centuries. And so let me put it like this. So you teach Homer, right?
Yep.
Do you teach the gods? By which I mean... Yeah, and the gods are pretty central to the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah, maybe even essential. I mean, they're absolutely a part of it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. But the thing is, nobody today, I imagine, believes that you have to believe in the gods of Homer in order to understand the story or appreciate it. Right? But this wasn't the case necessarily in antiquity, right? And this was the case that Julian made. Like, this is a story about the gods. It's almost like a religious text, right? But we feel comfortable in reading it as literature, not as a religious text.
Mm-hmm.
And that transition was first fully made in Byzantium. In other words, Christian scholars found ways of appreciating these texts that separated them from their religious aspect, right? And because they wanted to keep them, and they had this idea that, I mean, there's something going on in Homer that isn't what Julian thought, like some sort of religious, it's certainly not scripture, And so they developed ways of teaching and interpreting Homer and the gods that got around that problem. Now, some of these, by the way, are allegorical. And we don't tend to go for those today, like saying, well, Athena, Hera is the air, and Zeus is the climate, and Athena, like that sort of thing. And like it's all some sort of allegory. That was one way of doing it. Another was to focus exclusively on the mortal characters. So we have, you remember the movie Troy, right? It doesn't have the gods.
Mm-hmm.
It just wrote the gods out of it. Well, we have summaries of the Iliad from Byzantium that do the same thing. They just write the gods out of the story and just tell it as a straight human story. So there were some of those techniques. Others just treated the gods as essentially, characters of the plot, right? Without ascribing to them any kind of ontological, role. So all those traditions kind of developed over time. When we get to Eustathius of Thessaloniki, this is 12th century, he wrote this massive commentary on the Iliad and then a slightly shorter one on the Odyssey, where he kind of codified all of these different ways of reading Homer, in addition to just the rhetorical analysis, like what today we might call compositional or narrative analysis, right? And this is vast. I mean, it's thousands of pages in the modern edition. It's verse by verse, right? And we have an autographed copy of it. This is fascinating, right? Like written by his own hand, right? Plus the notes that he made in the margin, because he was always a perfectionist. And then when he didn't have room, he would write a little piece of paper and stick it in the...
I bet you wish...
It's really amazing. Yeah. So in the 12th century, we actually have a revival of Hellenism where the balance tilts toward the positive classical culture side of things and away from the aversion of paganism side of things. Mm-hmm. And in the 12th century, there are a number of scholars and orators, and some of them become bishops, who really, really love classical literature. And they find ways of working it into their engagement with their own culture, right? So I'll give you an example. Anna Komnena, right? The daughter of the Emperor Alexius Komnenos, the founder of the Komnenian dynasty. And she wrote an account of his reign, which is called the Alexiad, right? On the model of the Iliad. And she compares her father, Alexius, and her mother, Irene, to gods and goddesses throughout the text, right? So it's just a way of highlighting certain kinds of things that you can't get from the New Testament, for example, like martial, heroic, qualities, right? Or, just the physical beauty. Like, how do you describe those things? You can't from within the Bible. Like, it's not into those kinds of things. But I should note, just by way of keeping the other side always in play, that we have a story that Alexius had originally prevented Anna from basically becoming literate because he was afraid that by reading Homer, she would be morally corrupted. Mm. And that she learned to read secretly. She got some eunuchs at the court to teach her the letters secretly and so on. It's a kind of a stock story. But the point is, right, that these two responses to the classical tradition are always kind of in play. All right. But by the 12th century, Hellenism is sort of rehabilitated as desirable qualities of an educated gentleman or gentlewoman in the case of Anna, right? So it is a kind of elite identity. In other words, when a proper Hellene is not like your average Romios, or average Roman on the street, right? It's someone who has, that kind of background. So that's one way it was rehabilitated, yeah.
So then would a kid on the street, in Constantinople, would he have known the stories of Homer? Would someone have told him, some of the stories of the Odyssey or about Polyphemus or something? Or really was this something that was transmitted and preserved among the elites?
Well, mostly the elites, but, it's a difficult question to answer. But think about it this way. Constantinople was full of statues of the ancient gods. Because Constantine and his successors had adorned the city, right, with sometimes colossal statues of the gods and ancient heroes that they took from all over the Aegean and even the Eastern Mediterranean. So the average, child walking on the streets of Constantinople will have seen more classical statuary than is available today. Presumably they had stories about who all these people were, right? And though, some of those stories might just be wild, wildly off. The way in which, art and monuments get reinterpreted over the centuries. But I'll give you another story, which points in a different direction. In the 13th century, there was a Byzantine scholar, probably the greatest scholar of his age, Nikephoros Vlemidis. And he wrote in a letter that he went around looking for books. This is in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, destruction of Constantinople. And after that, they're trying to reconstitute their learned culture. And he wrote that he was in the Troad, right? This is near where the site of ancient Troy is. And in the chapel, there was a painting in the church of Saint Achilles. And he thought he would pass this along to the emperor, who was himself also, in love with classical things. So it's quite possible that memory survived about these heroes on a local level. Yeah.
That's a really interesting Saint Achilles. I wonder what happens to Hector. I want to bring us forward in time a bit, because I know this conversation is really fascinating and go on for a long time, but I do want to connect our conversation about Philhellenism or Hellenism in Byzantium to the revolution. So let's fast forward, if we can, a bit through time, and we're sort of in the 18th and moving into the 19th centuries. On the eve of the revolution, did Greeks who were about to revolt, did they understand themselves to be connected to Byzantium in a sort of specific way, or again, was it sort of cultural, impressions? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my reading indicates that they weren't vague impressions, that they had very specific and deeply felt associations with Byzantium. Now, keeping in mind that, of course, they didn't call it Byzantium because that wasn't its name, and they didn't call themselves Greeks. In fact, they are Rum in the Arabic and Turkish tradition, which meant basically Greek-speaking Orthodox. So they are Romei or Romi, and the actual name of Byzantium, that is at the time, was Romania, the land of the Romans, or Roman land. It had been called that since the 4th century. So by the 11th century, this was like the official state name, Romania. It would make treaties with foreign powers in the name of Romania and so forth. So Eromios would have a very instinctive and easy association with Romania. And so Greek texts from the Ottoman Empire, from the Ottoman period, many of them do display a very strong, effective link with Romania, our former, Vasilia, kingdom, monarchy, empire, call it what you will, right? So I'll give you a striking example. When the delegates, so right after the outbreak of the Greek Revolution, the delegates who assembled to start drafting, the Greek constitution at Epidaurus and other places in the Peloponnese. In one of the early drafts, they simply say that the laws of the new state are going to be the laws of our Christian emperors, by which they meant what we call the Byzantine emperors. Like, this was sort of understood to be, a kind of revival of at least the political aspect. Now that didn't actually happen that way, but it's just a striking illustration of how, yes, they absolutely did feel a continuity with that state.
Mm-hmm. So I want to actually, because our conversation has moved into the talk about the revolution, there's some interesting questions that have been coming up in the chat, and I thought I could sort of integrate that into our larger conversation. So
Sure.
One question sort of is framed in this way. When the Greeks were on the eve of revolution, there were other, let's say, neighboring peoples like those in Russia and in the Balkans who maintained a sense of solidarity with the Greeks. Was that rooted in this sense of Hellenism as something that they shared, or was it more to do with the Orthodox Christianity that was part of it, or a combination thereof?
That's a great question. It's easy to answer. That in the case of, say, Russia, it's definitely Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the important point, and why this question is so great. Byzantium is a culturally composite, right? It has Roman elements, it has Greek elements, it has Christian Orthodox elements. Now, we've spoken mostly about the first two, but Orthodoxy was a major part, right, of East Roman culture. And because it's this cultural composite, it has cultural resources by which to engage with different, neighbors or different constituencies, right? So when late Byzantines or learned Greeks under the Ottoman Empire are engaging with, say, Western Europe, they're doing so on the grounds of common interest in Hellenism, right? Be it Italian humanism, or be it early the 19th century romantic attachments to ancient Greece. So when you're engaging with modern Western Europe, this common interest in the classical past forms a bridge. And this is also why it was so much easier for the Western Philhellenes to recognize the revolution as a movement by Greeks rather than by Romani, which made no sense in the West for obvious reasons. Okay, but when late Byzantines or early modern Greeks are engaging, say, with Russia, there the common bridge is Orthodoxy. Largely, not exclusively, but largely so. And there, the soft power, if you will, right, is things like saints' lives and ecclesiastical traditions, vestments, icons, right? So it's just it's just configured very differently. So when at the time of the revolution, when the Russian Empire supported the revolution, it did so for very, very different reasons than why, Philhellenes from the United States went to volunteer and fight in the war. It was not because of Orthodoxy.
Yeah. So, again, that raises a series of interesting questions, how Greeks would, depending on their audience or depending on with whom they're negotiating, they could bring up one emphasis of one aspect of their past versus another. And so there's another question that sort of asks this about the sense of continuity. So, it is in some ways a peculiar jump to go from, let's say, classical Athens and Pericles to Gregory the theologian, to Anaconini, to the 19th century, all as a kind of unbroken line of succession. But is that how they thought of the past? Was it sort of all the way from the Bronze Age to present is one Hellenism, one culture, with variants beliefs along the way. I wonder if that's something that you could address.
Sure. Well, boy, that's a big.
It's a big question.
So no, it's not one line of continuity. It's lots of lines of continuity. Some of them don't make it after a certain point. Some start later and continue on right to today. It's lots of different entangled lines. There are so many narratives in which these histories are embedded, right? They're sacred narratives. That go from the Old Testament and the chosen people to the New Testament, the Incarnation, and Christian sacred history. That's one narrative in which Byzantine history is embedded. There is the history of the Roman Empire. When the Byzantines sat down to write their entire history, it would start with Aeneas leaving Troy and going to Italy and founding, and Romulus founding Rome, and then Constantine moves the capital to Constantinople. That's the story. It's a different story, and it's kind of laid on top of the other one, right? So these all come together in all these interesting ways. But let me actually take the specific examples that you mentioned, because they're actually so well chosen. How do you get from Pericles to Gregory the theologian? Well, Gregory the theologian spent 10 years studying in Athens, right? And he had to be dragged away from it, from his father, who basically told him, I'm going to cut you off if you don't come home. Because he loved being in Athens, in the shadow of the Acropolis, which was a temple of Athena at his time. Right? It was still like that. So the jump from Pericles to Gregory the theologian isn't that great. He went to study in Athens because it was the school of Greece, just like Pericles had called it in the funeral oration, right? And then between Gregory the theologian and Anna, I mean, it's a long time, but Gregory was one of Anna's main rhetorical sources. Like the Greek that Gregory wrote in his orations, right, to push back against Julian, right? Like what Gregory's trying to do in many of his works is say, look, we can use ancient Greek as well as you can. Like we Christians can use it as well as you pagans can, right? And Gregory's texts became like fundamental for, beyond their contents, just for learning how to use Greek, rhetorical Greek very well. And Anna had read them. So the link there is very direct. So for every leap that you take over the centuries, yeah, you can find some very strong lines of continuity. But each leap is going to have different lines than the previous one, right? I mean, it's a lot of strands woven together. Not all of them make it, after a certain point. Like we mentioned, the athletic games, the culture changes. All things change in the meantime, but it changes pretty slowly. It's like the image of Theseus' ship, that's in Plutarch, where you start replacing things on the ship over the years. Eventually, there's like no component is the original one, but it's the same ship, right? So for a lot of these stories, I think you can make that kind of use that metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's again a great answer to a complicated series of leaps. Another question from the audience asks about the influence of Byzantium in Western movements, let's say like the Renaissance. What do you see contributions by people from Byzantium, intellectuals, artists, whatever the case may be, on what was happening in, let's say, Italy and in continental Europe or the western part of Europe at that in an earlier period during the Renaissance?
Oh yes, I mean there's a lot, and it's very well documented. It has been studied a lot. The Italian humanism began with the study of Latin in large part because there was no direct access to the Greek classics in Italy for a very long time. Early scholars like Petrarch, they tried to learn Greek, didn't go very well. So for quite a while, for their knowledge of Greek, the Italian humanists relied on hiring late Byzantine scholars whom they brought to Italy with enticing job offers, right? Also, Byzantium is falling apart at the same time as being conquered by the Turks, so there was an incentive to leave. There was a lot of manuscript hunting for ancient authors, not just ancient authors, also Byzantine texts. And just to give you a striking example, the first printed editions of Homer, I think, were put together by a Byzantine scholar in Italy. And one of the early texts that were published was the Suda, which was a 10th century Byzantine dictionary of classical studies, the sort of thing that in the 10th century only Byzantium could produce. It's a really fundamental research tool. So yeah, in terms of scholarship and texts and literature and knowledge of Greek, the Byzantine contribution is decisive. I don't think that Western scholars really began to read Greek at the same level until about 1500. So I've looked at some translations from Thucydides, that Lorenzo Valla made. He was a great scholar. I mean, he knew Greek, but they're,
B plus, B minus.
B plus. Yeah. After 1500, you have some, much more serious, Hellenists in the West. So yeah, and then they developed this whole Erasmian thing to kind of, kick the modern Greek out. Yeah. There's also a considerable influence in terms of art. Especially the religious art. That's a whole other, yeah. However, having said all that, I would push back against the idea, which I heard growing up in Greece, that the Renaissance happened because some Byzantines fled from Byzantium because of the Turks, and they went to Italy, and lo and behold, the Renaissance happened because they were there. No. It wasn't like that. The Italian Renaissance is something that's very distinctively Italian. When they wanted to access the Greek material, they brought the Byzantines on board, but it was their thing. Yeah.
Well, an hour can go by really quickly when you're talking about something fascinating like we have been. And so I'm really grateful to you for sharing with us your knowledge. And of course, there were some other questions that I didn't have time to get to, but I think it is the right time to bring our conversation to an end and to express our gratitude. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple of announcements for our audience out there. And again, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you,
thanks to Philhellenis. Yeah. As March 25th, of course, an important date in Greek history approaches, we're really looking forward to continuing our series. And the next online conversation that we're going to have is with Professor Roderick Beaton on April 11th. And so please mark your calendars and join us. And I actually want to encourage you in the audience, if you really want to have a prepared mind for my conversation with Dr. Beaton, his recent book, Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation, really offers a fantastic narrative that explains much of the developments that lead up to the revolution and the aftermath of that, of course. And so a lot of my questions with him are going to be derived from that. But again, we're very thankful to all of our partners, and in particular to the Embassy of Greece in the United States, and our ambassador, Alexandra Papadopoulou, cultural attaché, Connie Mutupalas, and of course, our local consul general here in Chicago, Katerina Dimakis. And so, including them and all of our other partners, we're very, very grateful. But Dr. Kaldelis, once again, I want to just say thank you, and hope that our audience will jump on and listen to your podcast as well as read your books. So thank you again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ian.